Thrifting, thrift shopping has been around since in the 1950s. People would go to a thrift store because they desired vintage clothing. People still do this today and are able to find vintage items to their desired era. This is why I love thrift shopping. A thrift store slash antique store I enjoy going to is in downtown Riverside called Mission Galleria. This antique store has many sections that include toys, clothes, painting, jewelry, etc. that range from early 1900s into the early 2000s. One day, while looking around and looking at the old clocks, a woman next to me had a blue flashlight that was flashing around on the clock to the shelf while having an employee next to her. I move out of their way and still enough to hear their conversation. The woman says, "This has radium," to the employee. And out of curiosity, I turn and see the dials are bright neon. In my head, it reminded me of how Chuck E. Cheese would stamp you before you enter and would shine the blue light to make sure you were stamped. Thinking nothing about it, months later, I learned briefly about it during my AP government class in high school and how that bright neon light was radium that killed many women. Interested in this topic, I used my own time to learn about this radium. In the early 1890s, a woman and man named Marie Curie publicized radium, an element that is a radioactive metal. Marie Curie romanticized radium without knowing the negative effects of the radioactive metal. In the 1910s, at the beginning of World War I, soldiers were having a hard time telling time in the dark with their pocket watches. The radium companies put these in factories during World War I to create watches for the soldiers to able to see at night. This topic is important to me because it is a forgotten piece of history that has to do with women being put in toxic and dangerous conditions in factories when it was supposed to be a progressive movement for women to be able to work. This also helps people know and be grateful for today's better working conditions for everyone in the US. These women working in the factories are known as radium girls, who suffered major bodily defects, and today I want to shine a light on these women who help with today's working conditions by protesting to protect all workers. First, we'll talk about how these women worked in the factories. Then we will discuss the effects of the radium on the women. And finally, we look at how these women stood up for themselves and workers all over the US to work in safer conditions. Firstly, how did these women work in the factories? These women in the 1910s were taught a technique by the Orange, New Jersey, at the US Radium, which is known for being the most responsible for radium in the nation, called the lip dip paint technique. According to Wikipedia, these women would dip the tip of the brush in their mouths and between their lips to give the brush a fine tip, and then would dip in the paint called undark paint, made by radium, to paint the dials on the watches for the soldiers. These women were paid for how many dials they painted, which at the time was a highly paying job for women. Seeing as these was a major impact on women to support themselves and their families, little girls would also work in these factories to support their families financially. Women were hired to paint these dials on the watches because it was said that women's small and delicate hands were suitable for the detailed work. As a result of the lip dip paint technique, the women started to go through health issues. According to Brit Encia, Brit Nakia, the women would often get radium in their clothes and body, so they were then referred to as the ghost girls because of the glow that they would get on their faces due to the radium. The women would paint their nails, teeth, and their faces for fun with the paint. After some time of being exposed to the radium, women started to notice their pain in their teeth. Women started to report pain to their jobs, but their higher-ups lied to the women and told them it was nothing to worry about. A woman named Amelia Maggie's first symptoms was a toothache. According to Wikipedia, dentists were the first people to see the numerous dental problems like Amelia, who worked with radium. Amelia had to get 2 teeth removed, but then bleeding, pus, and painful ulcers in the place where the teeth used to grow occurred. Other women started to experience the same thing as Amelia, and others started to develop something known as radium jaw. Women started to become deadly ill, but doctors, dentists, and researchers were given hush money to not reveal their data on the negative effects, and it started to take a toll on women. Women noticed this unfair treatment and ignorance from the companies they worked with, so they decided to take legal action. With constant back and forth with the companies and the women, the companies did not want to give the women they caused to become deadly ill compensation for their medical bills and dental bills. According to the environmental history, one woman named Grace Fryer, who worked for Orange, New Jersey, and also fell victim to the deadly side effects, knew her and the countless other women who are suffering the same fate, knowing they did not have much time left, and became the voice of the Radium Girls. After having a hard time finding someone to represent these women in court, finally in 1927, an attorney named Raymond Berry agreed to represent Grace and the women in court against Radium Dial. Unfortunately, Radium Dial Co. denied the part they took in causing these women to suffer, and pretended to not know the radium was very toxic and harmful. It wasn't until 1938 Catherine Wolfe Doe successfully sued Radium Dial Co. She was one of the few women who successfully sued Radium Dial Co. before dying. As a result, these women brought national attention to the radium poisoning that they were not aware of while working for these radium companies. But their deaths were, but on their deathbeds, they still fought to the very last breath to help create laws to protect all workers. Firstly, we talked about the women who worked in factories. Then we discussed how the women were affected by radium. And finally, I talked about how the women took legal action. The radium girls who suffered from severe physical flaws who were working in the factories are credited for improving working conditions today and are by organizing protests to ensure the safety of all workers. These ghost girls still have radium in their bodies, regardless of being buried. Radium still remains in their body for 1,600 years, so the women will remain glowing in their graves. Looking back at when I didn't realize how close I was to radium at the antique store and the history it has behind it all, but now that I now know, I look up to these women who still stood up for themselves and their coworkers while having a huge part of their lives shaved off because of radium.